Let me turn on your mic because you would want, I know you want to make that.
These are some children from one of the most wonderful places in Jamaica.
The parish of Portmore?
In Portmore.
very, very well. So, I'm wondering if we should defer the confirmation of the minutes since we have our guests here and take it at the end so that we do not bore them with our confirmation of the minutes and going through the minutes. Okay? I'm going to ask that the members introduce themselves, especially since we have these students here, and I know that a lot of persons in Jamaica are watching and would like to know who we have here. But before you do the introduction, I just want to say that there was a resolution passed by all members of the House of Parliament, the lower house rather, and we debated it here, so to speak. We had discussion at our last meeting. And so we would have sent letters to the governor of the Bank of Jamaica and also the commissioner of police regarding coming here to assist us and the public in understanding the layout of the land. So without further ado, I'm going to ask the governor, Dr. Richard Biles, to lead the introduction. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Two of my colleagues on the far left, Dr. Jide Lewis. He is the deputy supervisor for all the banks. So he really has all the day-to-day control over supervising all the commercial banks. Senior Deputy Governor Wayne Robinson, who is the deputy to me, the governor, and has responsibilities more to do on the economic side, but also overall bank responsibilities. I am Richard Biles, the governor of the Bank of Jamaica. If you would permit me, Chair, I'd just like to make one brief remark before opening up. If you look at the laws that govern the Bank of Jamaica, you would be struck by how focused they are on prudential supervision. So they are concerned about the balance sheet of the banks. You know, are they strong? Do they have enough capital? Are their loans in good order? Are they profitable? All those things that speak to keeping the banks a going concern so that depositors' monies are safe. And so the whole of the legislation around the central bank is built on the basis of prudential oversight. Both the Banking Services Act as well as the Bank of Jamaica Act. And in a way that has served us well, because we have not had a bank crisis in this country for 30 years. That's not something that can be said by many other countries. Indeed, in 2008, there were many bank failures in the United States, and even during the pandemic, and shortly after, there were bank failures in the United States. We have not had any bank failure in Jamaica. So that very rigorous, tough, focused legislation around prudential management has served us well. However, starting in January of last year, when the Minister of Finance mandated that we should both the FSC and Bank of Jamaica moved to a twin peak form of regulation. We have taken time to not just focus on the prudential, but also on the issue of market conduct and customer service. And so from last year, about January when he made the announcement, we have had to move some of our focus away from just prudential and into the new area, new for us at BOJ, of market conduct and customer protection. So it is against that background, Chairman, that I think we should see these discussions which we'll have this morning. And I want to say that we are happy to be here to answer the questions that came out of your meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Biles. Okay, I'll ask the members from the JCF to introduce themselves at this time. Press the button.
Good morning. I am Deputy Commissioner Fitzbailey, in charge of Crime and Security Portfolio of the JCF. I am representing the Commissioner of Police, and with me is my staff officer, Deputy Superintendent Trayson Edwards.
Thank you. Okay, so there would have been some questions that was sent to the Bank of Jamaica in our letter that we would have sent. I don't know if we want to ask the governor to address those, and then we'll ask members to follow up. I have a few questions for you as well, especially since your opening remark with the focus of the bank being over time on the prudential aspect, which is laden, as you have said, from the various acts. So I have a few questions as it relates to that, but I'm going to ask that you just give us some response with regards to the correspondence that you'd have received from us. But
if I may, the resolution for which we are gathered here has two particular aspects to it. One regarding the ATM machines, and the other, the losses that are incurred by members of the public and the banks themselves too. That portion of the losses, the losses issue, I think, is the one pertains more to the JCF. So I don't know if you would, just for optimizing of particularly the JCF's time, if the governor could deal with the loss aspect of it first, because that is the section that we really want to have the input of the JCF on, and then we could then go into the ATM standards.
To address that issue.
Good morning, members. So essentially, from a legislative perspective, Section 39 of the Banking Services Act puts an obligation on banks to report to us immediately in relation to losses that they themselves have suffered as a result of fraudulent activities. We have sought to operationalize that particular provision in the Banking Services Act by issuing a reporting form where they will accumulate for the month losses which are below $1 million so that they can put effect essentially the agreement with the industries that if their loss is above Jamaican $1 million, they write specifically to us in relation to that matter. If it is below, then they would accumulate it in the report. That report focuses on the nature of the fraud, and we have categories. It focuses on the estimated loss as a result of that, but it's focused on the impact of that loss on their balance sheet, and not so much on the potential, if relevant, impact on the customer of the bank. Because again, as the governor would have outlined in his opening remarks, the focus of the framework is really on whether or not the loss will cause the entity to cease to be a going concern. We have very famous cases across the world, Bearing Bank, where, for example, a rogue trader would have made investment decisions that would have brought down the bank. And so it's very much focused on those areas.
Dr. Lewis, yes, we all are aware of the losses that are incurred by the banks, and as you referenced the governor's comment about the prudential focus, though I must say, Governor, yes, I do appreciate the focus of the BOJ, particularly what came out of the 90s and the bank situation where the whole supervisory role of the bank has been, BOJ has been revamped in order to ensure greater security and stability in the banking system. But the BOJ, in its broad mandate, has a responsibility, I would say, of equal proportion, not to just see to the stability of the banks and the banking system, but to also ensure that the licensees of the BOJ, the banks, in their conduct, also protect the consumer, because banking laws essentially is not just to protect banks, but to protect the public, whose monies they have in safekeeping. That said, we are aware that the banks have reported losses. The extent of it, we don't know exactly. And usually when there are internal losses, that is not generally made known for a variety of reasons. The focus or the concern is when the public at large experience the losses, and losses that are incurred through the banks or in transaction with the banks. And in the resolution, you will see, Dr. Lewis, it referenced Section 36 of the Banking Services Act, that duty of care provision in the Act, which imposes an obligation on the banks that once you receive someone's monies, each licensee of the BOJ have an obligation, a duty, to make sure that the monies, once it comes into the bank, is kept safe. Now, it is the duty of the bank to employ all the various technologies, methodologies, personnel, etc., to fulfill that obligation of safekeeping. That's an obligation. So when persons would have put their monies in the bank and they lose it, at least on the surface of it, it would appear that somebody didn't keep the money safe. In this case, the bank. Is it out of negligence? Is it out of whatever is the circumstance? But the bottom line is that someone, a customer, a depositor, account holder, would have lost their funds. Where is the obligation, and what are the processes and the practices to ensure that the bank fulfill this responsibility under Section 36 of safekeeping? And it is not by chance that the JCF is here, because I have encountered persons who have lost monies through the banks or through an account with the banks. And the banks, when the bank failed to compensate them for the loss, and they say, go and report it to the police. Now, John Doe, the farmer down in Clarendon or in Manchester, right, who all he knows to do is to work, earn his money, and put it someplace that is supposed to be safe. And he does nothing else, and he ends up lose the money. And then when he goes to the bank says, go to the police. What the police can do, or what happens in those cases. And we hear of many cases where people actually experience the loss. That is what have brought us here. Because that situation, in no civilized society, should just allow to just go like that, and that's the end of the day. There must be some recourse. Is it limitation in laws? Is it incapacity of the banks, whoever? But there must be a fix. I'm aware too that the banks also lose money in many of these circumstances. But our duty, and by extension, your duty, the BOJ that is as the regulator of the institutions that keep people's money, is to ensure that whatever that is to be done, ought to be done, is done to protect the public at large, because the public don't have nobody else to go to. They come to the state, and you represent the state, the BOJ. You're an institution of the state. You're not like any other private bank. You have a holistic, overarching duty for the society at large, and that's why we have to turn to you. So it is those issues. What are the fundamental causes for these losses? And again, the JCF, I don't know the extent of the dialogue that takes place between the banks. In the report from the JCF, the commissioner note that in recent times there have been increased collaboration and cooperation, particularly with NCB. That struck me that one bank was highlighted where the cooperation is. But I would think, Dr. Lewis, that quite frankly, where the public at large is suffering, the BOJ, as the regulator of all these deposit-taking institutions, ought to play a piloting role, a leading role in ensuring that your licensees are sufficiently protecting the public's money. So I want to also get the feedback from the JCF in their report. I don't know if you got a chance to see a copy of the report that the JCF provided. Chairman, I think
I'll ask that they be provided with a copy of the JCF report.
No doubt, Commissioner Bailey is fully apprised of the content and could provide some.
May I just, before you answer Mr. Jackson's question, that maybe Mr. Bailey want to summarize his report, because he has given us a summary of unauthorized access to customers' account in his report, so DSP, you care to probably share with us?
Essentially, for the period 2021 to 2024, we got 601 reports amounting to $306 million. And I want to point out that what was reported to us, because there are instances when the customer go directly to the bank and we do not get those reports. In 2022, for example, we had 179 reports in comparison to 189 in 2023. And that represented a 10 or 6% increase. And again, the National Commercial Bank and Bank of Nova Scotia were most impacted. That was 85% of the reports. Since January 2024, we have had 98 reports, and the total amount of money lost is $53 million. And these were offenses mostly committed through online transfers, automated teller machines, and point of sale, as well as wire transfers. We have arrested 127 persons over the period. And as was said, there's greater collaboration between us and the financial institution. And I must point out NCB in particular. And this has been not new. Over the years, we have always had that type of relationship with NCB. Sometimes it's very difficult to get support from the other financial institutions, the other banks. And some of the constraint that we have is that, notwithstanding the fact that the banks are, the customer has lost their funds. Sometimes it's difficult. We have to be applying for court orders through the judiciary to get the information, which sometimes slow down the investigative process. And one of the things that I would recommend to this House, that there should be an amendment whereby a court order can only be obtained when someone is arrested. If that is not done, we have to go through the ministerial order. And I think that aspect of the law need to be amended so that an officer can make an application before a judge for a court order before, to look at a person's account before the person is arrested. It really impacts on our investigative process without that authority.
You want Dr. Lewis to respond to your question?
Thank you so much for those questions. Just to say that there are two broad arms of our framework, but those two broad arms are circumscribed by the mandate of the bank, which are price stability on the one hand and financial system stability on the other. Within the BSA, there is provision that allows the supervisor to essentially ensure that the governance framework within each bank is robust and that their internal control environment allows them to identify, measure, determine sources of fraud, and then to treat with those. So that's one broad arm. And as supervisors, we do from time to time off-site surveillance as well as on-site inspections to satisfy ourselves that in fact those processes are there and operational. On the other arm is the Code of Conduct, which was issued under the Banking Services Act, that essentially requires each bank to have a complaints handling framework, which allows members of the public, customers, to essentially raise a complaint with the bank in relation to sums of monies that may have been lost while transacting with the institution. Banks are required to respond to that in 45 days, and they are required to do an investigation during that period and respond to the complainant. In instances where that is not satisfactorily executed from the perspective of the complainant, those matters can be and are referred to the Bank of Jamaica. And we look into the matter really from a perspective of requiring that the entity does further due diligence into the matter. The Code of Conduct, however, has no redress mechanisms embedded in it. So once we refer the matter for further investigation and the DTI, the deposit-taking institution, has satisfied itself that it has reviewed the matter and it's outside of its own control, then those matters then become referred to the Jamaica Constabulary Force. So those would be the reports. So it really depends on the nature of the particular complaint There's no one standard complaint. I looked through those letters myself personally, and it varies from situation to situation. You do have instances where the customer of a bank has transferred funds to another person. It's incorrectly transferred, and the other person just takes the funds. It's a member of the public. They see funds in their account, and they use the funds. That's a police matter, because the bank itself would have been following the instruction that was given by the client, and the other person that has received the funds erroneously has made a personal decision to use the funds. One could describe it as unethical, but regardless, that's the action that they have chosen to take. And so the DTI will tell the customer that they need to refer the matter to the police. And so a number of the cases that would have been referred to in this report would contain instances like that. There are other instances where customers of banks would make personal decisions to share their confidential PINs with members of family, friends, thereby breaching the terms and conditions of the product. And once they breach that, then the coverage and the sort of insurance that would travel with that particular product is forfeited. And so the investigation by the DTI, and if necessary by the police, would need to determine the details of the matter. So what you have, and when we write to banks, we always say the allegation is, because we're not doing the investigation, we're putting the matter before the commercial bank for them to do the investigation. In some instances, and in many instances, the customer is refunded, but there are instances where they are not, depending on the substance of the matter at hand. Internal fraud is also a police matter where it does occur within commercial banks. The culture has changed in recent times. Banks are naming individuals who they have found to be culpable of internal fraud. And of course, those individuals, if convicted within the courts of Jamaica, will not be deemed fit and proper and cannot be part of the financial system, because of course probity, financial probity, is the first criteria, even before expertise. If you're not an honest person, you're just not allowed to participate in that way, a la Section 36 of the Banking Services Act that was quoted earlier. So it's a nuanced matter. We are constrained in some respects. The code does take us some way in terms of standing between the customer of the bank and the complainant and the DTI. However, it does not have redress mechanisms. The reason for that is that those mechanisms would be ultra-virus, the principal act, which is around whether or not the bank is a going concern. And so we have to look at frameworks that would give the primary responsibility for consumer protection, which is and market conduct, which is a separate thought process from safety and soundness. The minister last year, as the governor would have pointed out, did give the directive that we are to move in a Twin Peaks model, where one institution would have prudential responsibility and the other regulator would have responsibility for market conduct and consumer protection. And within that framework, because the primary legislation would give the mandate, then all the attendant regulations, standards, rules, guidelines would then have the full force of law.
Member Jackson, you have a
yes.
Go ahead.
Dr. Lewis, I listened carefully. You said that the code of conduct take us somewhere. And basically, just a reporting provision. as you acknowledge, there's no enforcement of anything. They require the banks to tell the customers this, and basically you're finished there. That is as far as the code of conduct does. Whether they do it or not, extent to which they comply, if there's no enforcement, then it doesn't mean anything. That's one part I have a little challenge with. The other part, which you kind of gloss over, Dr. Lewis, the duty of care provision. And for me, that is probably one of the strongest provisions in the Banking Services Act as it relates to protecting the customers. If the law says, and it's every director, officer, and key employee of a licensee shall, in the discharge of his functions, A, act honestly and in good faith in the best interest of the licensee and for the protection of depositors' funds, and exercise the care, diligence, and skill that is necessarily prudent, a reasonably prudent director, officer, or key employee would exercise in similar circumstances. But I emphasize A, for the protection of depositors' funds. That's the part that I'm more focused on. As an obligation. Now you have oversight of the Banking Services Act. You are the enforcer to ensure that these licensees of yours do just that. So if I were sitting where you are, I'll never get there. But if I was sitting there, I would want to make sure that each licensee of the Bank of Jamaica have in place a mechanism to ensure that this is fulfilled. Because this is the public at large. The first part of the section deals with the institutions' safe practices. The other part deals with the public at large. So you must, Dr. Lewis, as a matter of duty, ensure that your licensees, the ones who give authority to take people's money, that they have some mechanisms, some protocols in place. You mentioned about sharing of PIN and things like those. If somebody is negligent and careless and cause their money to be lost, then they're on their own. But what I'm not clear on, and I don't know if the JCF in their investigations, because they would have handled many cases, to see or to determine if there's any lapse on the part of these licensees, the banks, to have caused those things to occur. And I would really like the commissioner to weigh in on that, because they have more detail and more experience on that than I or even you would.
Before you answer, because I'm going to ask the BOJ to respond to your question, and then DSP, you can also follow up with the statistics. Okay?
Chairman, my mic was on. I'd like to say something on this, and then perhaps.
Is it a follow-up? Because we just want to clear up.
Yes,
is a follow-up to the question.
So
you can go ahead, and yes. I'm going to ask you, Dr. Wayne Robinson, he said, and the member said he has a follow-up, which might be in line with your answer. So, Member Hilton, go ahead.
Thank you.
And before you go ahead, I see Member Molan, your mic is also on. Do you have a follow-up? Is it a follow-up question? Okay, very well. So I take Member Hilton, and then Dr. Robinson, you can go ahead and respond.
Let me just share, welcome each and every one, but let me share the perspective of Member Jackson on the duty of care. That must go beyond the systemic risk focus that the governor and yourself appointed to has been, before the Twin Peak policy shift, that has been the main focus of the bank. Important as that is, very important. But it seems to me the issue is a bit more complicated, because a part of what facilitates what is happening is the whole matter of technology and how technology is integrated into the banking system. And it seems to me that that itself represents a systemic risk to the banks and the financial architecture. And that must perforce have occupied and is occupying the minds of the BOJ as to how these new technologies themselves facilitate the fraud and the increased risks to the banks. And I would like in the answer to come, first of all, let me emphasize, the BSA, Banking Services Act, which incorporates the duty of care, cannot be narrowly construed to focus only, solely, or even largely, well, I wouldn't say largely, on the systemic prudential consideration. That's a part of it. But it must address the risk to customers. And it has always been there. Now, whether you had sufficient regulation, whether you had sufficient regulation to give guidance on directions in pursuance of that, that's a matter that I'm interested to hear. But in the architecture, certainly that element of care outside of, that is not inward looking, but focus on the other aspect which must be important, which is the protection of people's money in the bank, has been there. The technology I want to be, because I want to hear about that, because that facilitates a lot of what is happening. And to me, $300 million over a 2-year period is a whole heap of money. That's a whole heap of money that has been implicated. And that itself presents a systemic risk to the banks. So even if your focus is inward and prudential, yeah, I know the banks deal with trillions. The banks deal with trillions, but $300 million in a 3-year period. And we're not clear about where the technology is going and how that is being utilized to think is a problem. And I would think that that should occupy the minds of the BOJ.
Good morning, everyone. Just want to clarify that we do not disagree with the points that the members have made, and in particular the point that you just made as it relates to the duty of care. And indeed, importantly, the interlinkages between this matter of fraud risk and potential systemic risk. We do not disagree with that. And in our supervisory operations, in our supervisory processes, we look at the internal governance structures within the bank to ensure that the banks have proper risk mitigation strategies. But what we want to clarify and what we want to make clear is that the issue and the challenge as we see it is in terms of enforcement, because that is where the rubber hits the road. And what we're saying is that, as the Deputy Governor said earlier, we do not have a sufficiently robust redress mechanism where consumer protection matters are concerned. If you look at the BSA in detail, our ability to, for example, impose financial penalties requires the matter to rise to the issue, the very same issue that you mentioned, where there is a threat to systemic soundness and the systemic stability of the bank or of the system. So what we're saying is that the regulation and the processes need to be strengthened so that the regulator can have a more robust redress mechanism. And that is what we are pursuing under the Twin Peaks framework. In respect to technology, and DG Lewis can speak more to that. We recently issued some standards and guidelines as it relates to cyber risk. So I'll turn over to CPD.
If I may. So in December, would have issued guidelines, principles that entities should follow in terms of managing cyber risks. And cyber risks we are recognizing is a significant conduit that fraudsters are now using to gain access to the accounts of depositors. Those guidelines, those principles were supported by guidelines which we're consulting on and should be finalized, I would say, within a month. Thereafter, they'll become binding. And basically, what that will do is seek to create minimum standards around the kind of the integrity of the systems that banks must have in place to ensure that they can fend off the attacks of fraudsters who want to gain access to the accounts of customers. That will be supported by other exercises such as penetration tests, which essentially would allow us to see how robust the IT systems of banks are and give them feedback in terms of what they would need to do to close out on that. We have in recent years also been using supervisory technology to evaluate whether or not banks have systems that can alert them quickly in terms of suspicious transactions, including fraudulent transactions. And embedded in the ABM guideline, which was just promulgated, there's a requirement that the bank then alerts the customer immediately via text message, via email, as to that suspicious activity. So these are actions that we are taking in recognition that, yes, given the increasing digitization of banking, which is inevitable, that the robustness of their IT system is going to become critical. So we do take that on board. Just to also anecdotally say that the hidden person in this conversation that really needs to be singled out are criminals, right? As we have this conversation, we must remember that there are people who spend their time trying to figure out how to defraud other persons. And those criminals are quite agile. We did a fraud survey back in 2020, found that the criminals were using cloning the debit and credit cards of customers. So we cooperated with the industry and they transitioned to using chip and pin debit and credit cards, which is harder to clone. And then the fraudsters started to attack the cash delivery vehicles that are loading the ABMs. So it's a dynamic process. And of course, the partnership with the JCF, the partnership with MOCA, partnership with the banks is critical because we have to become very agile to adjust. I think since then, the security arrangements around these vehicles that do facilitate cash management on behalf of banks has strengthened. But then we need to look out for what is the next round and line of attack, because if somebody has a stream of income that's coming to them and that dries up, then they start to innovate. So it is going to be an iterative process, and there's no one silver bullet in that process.
I have some follow-up questions. May I, member, since you have, is it a follow-up question? Because I want to go back to the duty of care that member Jackson spoke to. Let me just, member, with regards to duty of care, from the perspective of your oversight responsibilities to the bank, have you found that the bank have discharged their duty of care? Because that is very important for you to, you the oversight body, to really tell the public, that whether or not you have found the bank discharging their duty of care. Because I listened to your initial response, and what you had said was that there are some customers who would have gotten refund. And there are others who would have breached, the loss would have come about because they would have breached their condition of their contract with the bank. And I take it that if they would have breached, then the bank is going to say that they are not going to refund you because you ought not to have shared your password with a family member or with anybody at all. So hence the question for the public to understand from your oversight perspective, what have you found? Thank you.
I want to just clarify. So the duty of care provision is not an all-encompassing provision where consumer protection is concerned. And I'll tell you why. Not all frauds affect the deposits of a customer. Some frauds affect their loans. Some frauds affect other facilities that they may have with the DTI. The provision around duty of care around the deposits is specifically in relation to ensuring that the funds that persons lodge with the DTI are managed in a way such that when they go to withdraw, they have immediate access to those funds. So the provision is an important provision, but it is not designed as a consumer protection provision because consumer protection is a wider issue, and there are many interactions that a member of the public has with a DTI that goes beyond just whether or not they have a deposit with that DTI. So I just wanted to qualify that statement. So it is a very important provision, and we take that on board, and we do take that very seriously. Having qualified that, however, I want to say that during our reviews of the DTIs, where we see gaps in their internal control environment, where we see weaknesses in governance, where we see lack of reporting, those are things that we write them up for, and they are required to close those matters within the stipulated time that we provide for them. And we then go back, re-examine, and evaluate. So we have found, generally speaking, that when we do indicate matters that are of concern to us in writing, those are examination letters, that those matters are addressed directly and they're closed out. Last year, we would have had opportunity on the direction of the governor to meet with every single board of every single deposit-taking institution to remind them of their responsibilities in terms of governance, that the buck stops with them. And we would have issued standards to them in relation to how they go about executing on that governance. Board composition, how often they should meet, what they should be looking at, concerns we may have observed in the past. So that's what we monitor them against. Finally, the amounts that are being lost are extremely regrettable. We would want that there be no fraud losses in the system. But we have to appreciate that globally, if you compare fraud losses in Jamaica with fraud losses elsewhere, there's no jurisdiction that can boast that it has $0 of fraud losses. It's just a part of the operational risk that the bank, the commercial bank, undertakes when it decides to go into this business. What we want to make sure that they do, however, is have in place a mechanism to investigate claims against them, ensure that having investigated those claims come to a determination as to whether they're culpable, treat with the issue that led to the culpability, and refund the customer within 45 days. Now, we can have a discussion whether 45 days is too long, whether it's too short, but that's what's embedded currently in the code, and that's what we monitor them against. In complaints that come to us, where we find the argument of the commercial bank or merchant bank or building society weak, we do push back. And we do ask them to have another look and in the spirit of good customer relations to reevaluate. And in many of those cases, refunds are made. But we have to make sure that we understand the perimeter within which we are allowed to legally operate. And if there is a legal challenge against our action, we would have to then be able to defend that we were acting within the remit and the confines of our law.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Chair. And I would like to welcome. There was. Oh.
The major challenges is the issue of cyber fraud, and especially as it relates to malicious malware. I think that's where the big problem lies in dealing with even our investigation. Because what we find, and I'm coming from the days when we never had these problems, the real world, and then you have the cyber issue that we have to deal with. When we had the real world instead of the virtual world, because it's just a transfer of what obtained in the real world into the virtual world, the type of complaint that we're having from customers is a little different, because what we find is that there's a shift, to me, and from where we stand as law enforcement officers, is that a lot of the financial institutions are now shifting the burden from themselves to the customer. And essentially what they are saying, that you have a responsibility to police your account. I mean, I have to treat with it as a professional and as a member of the JCA, but I am a customer as well. Just over the weekend, I got a report from someone who had her money in the bank, a nurse by profession, saving a few US dollars that when she traveled, her account was overtaken, taken over by the cyber people. And when she made contact with the bank, and I spoke with members from the bank, and the first thing they say, that's not their responsibility, it's her responsibility. It's obvious that they clicked on something that they should not have clicked on. Now, it's a very delicate situation that we find ourselves in, because oftentimes the customers, they put pressure on us as law enforcement officers, because they sort of redress that they should get from the bank. They are not getting it. And the bank is saying that it's not our responsibility. And these are some serious, I mean, think about the legislative obligation of the customers. There are certain laws that constrain us as individuals and as customers in terms of what volume of money you can keep, for example, at your home. You have to basically lodge your money to a financial institution. That's one of the issue. The know your customer policy. That's another issue for me. How do we now ensure that is enforced? Because I believe that knowing your customer also involves understanding the pattern of transaction that is done by the customer. And I think with technology that we do have, I think there must be some way where we have artificial intelligence, whereby that some regime is put in place, whereby once there is a particular transaction that is not consistent with the particular customer, then there must be some level of alert, and the bank should be held responsible to ensure that some of those transactions are blocked. I mean, as I said, the law enforcement agents were now put under extreme pressure because the clients and the customers are not getting the type of redress that they anticipate at the bank. So it's quite significant. And if I may just make us a recommendation, And this is about enforcement. In 2010, when we had a proliferation of debit and credit card fraud, significant, when we had the skimmers that used to be imported, etc., and we work along with custom to make those restricted items. But in addition to that, there was a joint initiative between the financial institutions, and one of the problems that we are faced with is that the institutions are operating in silos. And I understand the whole competitive nature of the financial sector, but I think there needs to be greater collaboration. We started an initiative, and the objective was the JCF, the law enforcement, provides investigators to support the banks. But the banks collectively, they must twin the investigator with somebody that they employ. And the objective was to minimize some of the bureaucracy and also to transfer some of the knowledge of investigation to these individuals. When we started, some of the banks hesitated. They never gave the corporation. Again, I must comment, NCB, BNS, they were the two more banks that were involved. Within the first 6 months, and if we do the research is there, one of the institutions that was losing over $50 million, I think it's per quarter, per month, I don't remember the exact. Within the first 6 months of that initiative, they had a zero loss. Significant reduction. The fact is that the level of support is no longer there. And I think in terms of this type of challenge, which is not going to go away, I don't know if the Bank of Jamaica may force that type of structure, a structured approach whereby the banks are obligated to institute or create that investigative support, if I may use that. I don't know, we can tweak it the way, whatever. And the police will be, and it was done based on research. As a matter of fact, I will say this, I was doing a course of study. And I did a research on what obtained, for instance, in the United Kingdom. And there was a specific unit that was set up. Initially, it was staffed mostly by police officers. But after the transfer of skills, it was mostly staffed by civilians. And they would take the investigation to a certain level, and then when it requires the police intervention, they go in and they do the arrest. I think creating a model like that would significantly impact once you have the right expertise to treat with it. And just a recommendation I'm actually making.
All right. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members of the team, for being here this morning. I had a few questions based on the discussion that has been taking place. One, as it relates to, and I think Dr. Lewis, you alluded to it, but you didn't answer my question in full, the question I was thinking about. What percentage of losses, what's the average percentage of losses do we have in banking systems, probably across the Caribbean? So we can have a more comparative assessment of the losses. 306 million over 3 years can be alarming, but I also want to put it in context, looking at other banking systems and how do they, what amount of losses do they incur? Are we above average, below average, around average? And it can give an indication as well as to the robustness of our financial legislature. So that is the first question. The second one pertains to something you mentioned earlier, and incidences that came up in the banking system can vary. So we know that for someone who may have shared your PIN, you need to have a different scale of escalation compared to someone who may have transferred money inaccurately to an account. But I do believe that there can be safeguards and mechanisms in place. For example, just off the top of my head, and I'm not a banker, persons who transfer X amount of funds, those funds are held for 24 hours or something to that effect, instead of an immediate, when I say held, the receiving institution can hold them for confirmation, depending on amount. I think DSP mentioned something to that effect. And I wanted to ask, based on the current law and structure, because this is something that I have a lot of persons who have experienced inaccurate transfers and monies have gone missing. And when they call the banks, you know, in uncertain terms tell them that they have to locate this customer, contact the receiving bank, locate the customer and ask them to send back the funds. So the bank essentially take themselves out of the entire transaction. Now, it could be a genuine error, and in cases such as those, I think the bank within itself, and this may goes to Fitz-Bailey, DSP, wouldn't the bank be facilitating the transfer of funds illicitly in instances where persons would have received monies that were not meant for them and they would have used it? Wouldn't that, within the current framework of the law, constitute receiving of illicit funds? Because in all uncertain terms, they would have known those funds don't belong to them, and then they would have gone ahead and used it. So I think one question would go for you, Dr. Lewis, and the other one for you, DSP, or probably both. I'm not sure, and that's the other thing. I'm sitting here, I'm not sure. The laws that are being mentioned is not totally clear. As a politician, we are here to represent the people and ensure their interests are preserved. And from what I'm seeing so far, and I think Mr. Biles mentioned it earlier, I think there's a lot of gray areas that needs to be clearly defined, especially how certain issues and certain redresses are made within the financial institutions. So I'm going to stop there because I have other questions pertaining to other areas, but I don't want us to shift from this area without myself getting some clarification on how we can address these.
Turn it off.
I think the issue regarding mistakenly transfer funds, that's basically a matter for the police. I agree that if I mistakenly transfer money to another person, then the law makes provision for that, lastly by mistake, etc. That can be dealt with. But I think the bigger issue is where the malware is used. And for example, the incident I referenced, the lady's account was compromised. Funds were transferred from her account to her son's account, then from her son's account to another account, and then the money disappeared. And the first response of the bank was, no, that's not their responsibility. Somebody clicked when they should not have clicked. Maybe the son clicked on some website that he should not have clicked on. And these are the greater issues, I think, that the customers are faced with. I think one of the banks would know, there's a particular bank who continue to promulgate the concept and issue advising a no-click policy. I personally am a police officer, and I'm very mindful of the fact that I have some responsibility. But I don't know what that no-click policy is. I go on different websites, different platforms, and are they saying to the customer, you just don't click on certain things? You have different pop-ups that, you know, a person is ignorant. I mean, mindful of the reality that, and maybe I'm stretching my answer a little, but when you think of a customer who is basically a novice when it comes to cyber matters, a customer, and in the banks literally encourage customer to go online. It's not, they discourage people from doing the old traditional way of banking. And I strongly believe that there needs to be greater protection in relation to that. Maybe I'm going outside of, but I think there needs to be greater. As a law enforcement officer, I don't think we should just say, once you click, you give away your key, and that's it. Our responsibility ends as a financial institution. I think there needs to be, in the real world, we would investigate that. The bank would make reports. We investigate and we do arrest people in many instances. It's a little more challenging in the cyber world. But these are matters that can be investigated too, although it takes more resources for that to be done. And I think that's just a concern from law enforcement that we have in respect to that. But the matter about transferring, mistakenly transfer, that's really an easy case to deal with. It's only that when it have international implication and to get the support from the international partners, sometimes it can be a little time consuming. But those are matters that can be investigated.
I'm going to see Dr. Biles been waiting for a little while. Okay, Dr. Biles.
No, just to say that I don't have the statistics on me now in relation to how our losses compare to other jurisdictions. I do know when we had done that look maybe about 12 to 18 months ago, we were below many other jurisdictions. Many of the fraud typologies that come to Jamaica really come to Jamaica from either Europe or Canada or the United States, and they filter down through the Caribbean. And we track how that typology then comes to evolve and emerge here. One of the things I would have mentioned earlier as well is that when you have a reduction in a particular type of typology because of an action, you have a reaction as well. And so I think it's an ongoing effort. I think whatever channel that members of the public use to access financial services, there are going to be risk exposures with passbooks. When you had your things printed out, the ink fades, you're not quite sure what your balance is, you lose your passbook. That's the critical document that you need to be able to access and engage with the DTI and so on. And that's in the real world. I think the challenge is that we have to collaboratively look at how do we sensitize the public in terms of some of the challenges in the digital world, including how persons can protect themselves, because ultimately speaking, the bank is providing a facility, whether that facility is a passbook or that facility is a bank account password on a website or a mobile phone, and it's how to understand some of the challenges that particular, we call it a channel of distribution, the challenges that poses, and to ensure that the banks are educating their customers and the public. The typology that's being mentioned by my colleague here is phishing, smishing, where essentially text messages are being used to say you've won $1 million, just call us. And of course you call the number and they say, well, just give us your username and password. And the person, and I'm going through these because of course this is a public forum and hopefully someone will hear this. And so the person divulges their username and password, and then the person says, well, you're going to get the money soon. And of course, the money is being deducted from the account. Similar things happen online via email, and when you click on that link, it's taking you to a site that looks like a bank account or a bank's website, but it's not. So when you're entering the information, you're not accessing the bank's online system. What you're doing is you're really updating your information into a database that the fraudster now can use to then attempt to access your account. And of course, there are protections that can be done. So for some banks, you put in your password, they'll send you a code, and the code then is known not by the fraudster but by the customer. and the customer needs to enter that particular code. It's a two-factor authentication system. But if the customer then also gives the code to the fraudster, so the fraudster calls back and say, boy, I'd love to give you the $1 million, but you got a special code. If you give me that code, I'll give you the $1 million. So you get what I'm saying? So ultimately speaking, even if you have five-factor checks and balances in terms of access, if the customer doesn't know what a fraud setup looks like, then that system will always be defeated. It's the same thing for cyber resilience in a company. The employees need to understand what does a fraudulent attack look like. If they don't, they're going to expose the company to that risk. And so as a country that is advancing and using technology, these are challenges that we're going to have to summon. And I certainly do hear the call from the JCF to partner. I think there's a wonderful opportunity for us to partner with the JCF, with the Jamaica Bankers Association, to see to what extent we can close some of these gaps. But human error is something that there's no technology to correct for human error apart from training the human to understand the features. Just like in Jamaica, you know if somebody is approaching you and they're running and they're holding their hand in one pocket, you interpret that action as being threatening. And so you react, you run or you duck or you take evasive action. It's the same kind of education that's going to be needed in the digital space, where you say, if I'm getting an award for lotto and I never entered a lotto thing, then why am I getting this prize? You know, those sorts of things. Thank you.
Jide made some of the points I wanted to make. And I think, Deputy Commissioner, your intervention has been very useful. That movement from the real world to the digital world carries with it a set of rules that need to be elaborated for the new digital world. And we haven't got there yet, and that is what the Twin Peaks is supposed to deliver. A set of rules to do with today's reality about digital transactions, and to go into it in depth and take into account a lot of those experiences that have been shared to make the rules and the training very robust. And so I think we need to just take the time between now and when that legislation comes to this House to make sure that it addresses a lot of these issues. In the old-time real world, if you walked out of the bank with a brown paper bag, you were at risk. That is a rule that you don't break. If you walk out of the bank with your handbag hanging down, people steal it, that's a rule again that you know and that you would protect yourself against. In the digital world now, not clicking on this and not clicking on that has to become a second nature as holding your handbag more securely and don't bother with a brown paper bag. So I think that the Twin Peaks issue is really important, and we have to pay attention to make sure that it gives the responsibility to the right party, that the bank has its own share of responsibility and that the customer has its own share of responsibility. And Deputy Commissioner, can I say, I've written it down, and at the next meeting of the Jamaica Bankers Association, I'm going to raise again the question of twinning and not investigation. I recall that I think it's an excellent suggestion, and I know that some banks had it operational, but it needs to be deepened and taken seriously.
Thank you, Chairman. And let me just tell you, I'm pleased with the direction in which the conversation has gone, because I really think that unless we, and it's really the big discussion about the transition from the real to the digital and how that is managed and what are the various roles and responsibilities to be assigned in that new scenario. But let me ask, so that I think is really what needs to be preoccupying us as policymakers and as supervisors and bankers and enforcers. But in the meantime, I don't want to lose sight of some basic things because people are losing money in the meantime. And one question I want to ask, two questions. The level of, because whatever we experience here in Jamaica, it's hardly likely that it was initiated here. We have some geniuses, I agree, and some innovators, but it's a global phenomenon. I must ask then, what is the level of cooperation? Firstly, on this issue, because that's the emergent issue, that's the world in which we are moving into. So the focus, what is the level of cooperation? I assume there are many. I just need to satisfy myself that that is going on, that is a structured approach to the problem. And within that, I wanted to ask a matter that I think is well within the bailiwick of the supervisor now, which is bank refund policy. Simple, that's a low level. This is where the rubber touches the roads with the individual. And I ask it because I've heard of different situations, well, similar situations, being treated differently. And so it raises in my mind, is there, as part of the supervision, to ensure that there is that there's a refund policy that is functional, and two, what is the symmetry between those refund policy? Because, as I've said, I've seen people, know people who are in similar situation, but the outcome has been dissimilar. And I really believe that that's a low-hanging fruit that I believe is well within the supervisory capability of the bank, and the larger question about the cyber situation. Thank you.
You want to comment, respond?
Okay, thank you for those questions. The first question, in terms of sharing of information, in terms of cyber, the JBA does have a subcommittee. That's the Jamaica Bankers Association has a subcommittee that looks at fraud-related matters. Each bank has a function within it that looks at the matter of fraud. Again, they're looking typically at the matter of fraud from an asset protection perspective, meaning protecting the assets. Now, with banking, the liability of the bank are the deposits, and the assets is how they invest those liabilities. And so they're, whether those are loans, and of course cash is also their asset, which is the mirror image of the deposit, is also there. So just to say that they do have, they're well structured and organized in terms of being able to investigate those particular matters, and they do share amongst each other information about new typologies. We have supported that effort at the central bank by sharing with them the fraud information across the sector. So each quarter we do share with the banks how frauds are evolving in the system, so that they have a panoramic view as they talk with each other. And we found that was a gap before, because everybody's looking at their own event, but not necessarily understanding the broad macro system in which they are operating. And I think that has assisted some in that, and they have a very keen interest on that data set, which they submit to us per Section 39. We are seeking to, with the cyber resilience guidelines that have just been consulted on, which we expect to be concluded shortly, we want to support that framework with a cyber incident sharing framework, where each DTI will report into this framework so that they, again, from a cybersecurity perspective, understand what are the threats on the landscape and how they can organize themselves, so that the silos, which would have been mentioned by the Deputy Commissioner, would have been, those silos can be eradicated, minimized, reduced, depending on how successful that particular venture is. That's something that we're looking into currently, and we are anticipating that that would be launched before the end of this year. That, I think, is going to be critical because it will tie us into the global economy, where they also have cyber reporting, incident reporting frameworks, and therefore we would sit, rather than looking at anecdotal stories, we'd be looking at statistics that says this is what is happening and this is how it's coming from across the Atlantic to the island, and track it even when it gets here and how it's evolving. So definitely the fraudsters have been able to take advantage of the siloed approach to fraud prevention that has been the traditional approach taken by banks. So those are initiatives we are very well aware of. There's a program that we'll be engaging them on. We'll be supervising them in this particular regard, seeing to what extent they are adjusting their frameworks to the different typologies as it's being registered in that system. So there's a program of work that is before us to really tackle frontally this issue of cyber fraud and how it affects the banks, and therefore how it affects the customers of banks. And so we'd be giving updates on that as that progresses. Your second question. Bank refund policy. Okay, so the bank refund policy really is embedded in the Code of Conduct, which was promulgated in 2016, which requires each DTI to have a complaints handling framework, have a designated officer who is doing the review of these complaints as a 24-hour job. That's what they do. So it's not a separate, they're not doing that and issuing loans and opening the front door of the bank. They're responsible, their remit, along with their team, is to look through these reports and to corral the internal resources of the bank to investigate. Refund would be embedded in that policy because they're required to have, that function is required to have a policy which guides their actions per the requirements of the Code of Conduct. And so the refund policy would be embedded in that broad policy where having collected the information, having done the investigation, if they find that they are culpable on the one hand, or the customer is not culpable on the other hand, there should be reciprocals of each other, that they can then, they would have a mechanism to refund the customer. Now, this is not a perfect system, and one of the thematics that I think we will try to engage in short order is to look at the complaints handling frameworks across our DTI system to see to what extent there are inconsistencies in approach, and to give general guidance to them in terms of what those minimum standards are. And that's a body of work that we will be undertaking over the next few weeks and months ahead. Just from a complaints handling and a refund policy perspective, and that's certainly something that we can take on. And is within our work program. Just to be clear, it is a part of our work program.
Go ahead, Mr. Jackson.
A couple of follow-up. The Twin Peak governor that was mentioned of, and you have a mandate. I don't know if you recall, Governor, in 2018, the former Minister of Finance gave that undertaking, that was an instruction to the BOJ to put in place. Twin Peak would provide for the kind of customer protection provisions that you talk about. That would be embraced in the Twin Peak provision.
The Financial Services Commission are going to be the specialists in respect of market conduct and customer protection, and BOJ is prudential.
Yes. What I'm saying is that the protection the minister mentioned then would be in that framework to be promulgated.
Correct.
And that was from the 13th of February 2018. That undertaking was given by the former minister. The current minister last year,
Yes.
in around June, gave that undertaking again. And we're about 1 year, near
Yes.
1 year running,
Yes.
right? So the framework and the mechanism remains outstanding for as long as the problem has been prevailing.
Yeah.
So if I sound a little bit cynical, Dr. Lewis, about what is to come, my cynicism was not plucked out of thin
Yes.
air.
No, I understand, member. And can I say, you know, the process of legislation is so difficult, tedious, and time-consuming in this country. And people tell me it's the same the world through, but I cannot believe it.
No, that is not all true.
We
have
have-
seen legislation come to this parliament in 1 day and pass. So it's not a generic problem. It's a
Well-
selective one.
Well, in the case of Twin Peaks, you know, to start from scratch and to build a market conduct and customer protection legislation, because we have no real history of it, and we don't have a strong foundation starting from, we've had to sit and craft that. And then it has to go to this committee and that committee and back and to the AG. And we have spent a year, remember, a year we have spent trying to get this legislation to the level of cabinet. And we are hopeful that it will get to cabinet in the next few weeks.
Governor, I hear you, but I've been here long enough to know that the speed of legislation depends on the urgency attached to it. We have passed financial legislation at bolt speed in this House. So legislations will take long, yes, depending on the urgency that is attached to it.
And maybe the complexity too.
And you know, complexities, yes. But when we have complex problems, we delegate the resources, human and otherwise, and in many instances, we also import the expertise
Yes.
when they are not here because of the urgency and importance that we attach to it.
Member, can I say, I absolutely agree with you. And it's not as if we are sitting with our hands tied. We are trying to, as we say, practice Twin Peaks. So all that work that we did with the ATMs recently, for which I know you feel personally connected to, and for good reason, has been done outside of our legislative capacity. We have sat with the banks and said, although we don't have the right to tell you these things, let us work out some standards that are more acceptable to the public and which can serve them better. And that is how we got the recent ATM standards done. So even as we wait for the legislation to be implemented, we are practicing it in reality. And many of the suggestions that have been made here are suggestions that we can go to the banks and start to say to them, can we not address some of these issues? And we will. We're happy to.
I'm going to delay or defer comment on the standards and the promulgation of it since we're dealing with it in the second phase. But to come back to the losses issue, you know, Dr. Lewis, I listened to you addressing the whole duty of care provision alluded to by my colleague. But it seems like it's a very prescribed qualification attached to how far do you go in respect of the obligations of the financial institutions. Because in my layman's term, you are more expert than I am on these matters. When I read the legislation, which is in clear layman's term, in the interest of the licensee and for the protection of the depositors' funds. And when I listen to the comments by Deputy Commissioner of Police, I don't know if you become comfortable, Dr. Lewis, that the financial institutions that you have oversight over, if they are taking sufficient steps to ameliorate the problem that he alluded to. I really don't think so. And I come back about the ATM thing and the standards and adherence to it. Even the ABM standards, as you say, in the absence of legislation, when people are suffering out there with the machine, they could have done what has been done in the absence of legislation that only came about because of a parliamentary mandate. So the point I'm trying to make, Governor, is that left on their own, they do the least. They do the least. They don't exert themselves, in my mind, and I think in the public's mind, sufficiently when it comes to protecting the customers. And we heard what the commissioner said. When they report, they say, go and report it to the police. That's what the response is to the banks. Because when you go report it to the police, I don't have anything to investigate. You lose your money, but let the police deal with it. That is the kind of laziness that I referred to in the past, as it relates to protecting the customers. People are experienced, for those reported to the JCF, over how many millions, Commissioner? $301 million. And look at the recent data between January and now in the report, there's about 98 reports to now, compared to 178 and 79 the year before. We're more than half. At just 4 months in the year, if I just make a correlation between number of reports and monetary loss, it's a significant amount. It's increasing. And then they say, let's go and report it to the police. That is not sufficient. There must be some obligation, Dr. Lewis, for them to put in place and somebody to make sure that they are putting these things in place rather than just recommend it to them in a meeting. It's good customer relationship for you to do these. And so if they don't do it, so what? You say you're a naughty boy and they just continue doing what they are doing. But while they are continuing what they are doing, people are losing their hard-earned money. That is the consequence of it. And I really don't believe, Dr. Lewis, that with your circumscribed qualification of duty of care, that there is any impetus to really cause them to do it. The record is there. Left on their own, they do the least. And people suffer. So I want more from you. And what I'm disappointed about, the Governor, every time that the BOJ needs regulatory provision, needs legislative provision, you refer to some of them that is complex and takes some time, and being in government ourselves, we rely, ministers and government rely on regulators to keep them abreast of what is happening in the sector that they regulate, not just from an informational standpoint, but to promulgate the necessary regulation and legislation and amendments. We do many amendments to acts in the Parliament routinely to enable the regulator to do their job effectively in protecting the public's interest. The JCF does that in their field of law enforcement. So we have a lot of bills and acts that we have to be amended from time to time. You out there interacting with these institutions, knowing what their experience is, you must be knocking on our doors, we legislators, to provide legislative strengthening where they are weak, provide new legislation where they are absent, in order to fulfill your duty of protecting the public. And that is my real pain, Governor, is that the Bank of Jamaica is not asserting itself as a regulator of these institutions in ensuring that they protect the public. We don't have anybody else to go to until Twin Peaks is in place. What happened between now and then? We die? So, tell us what we need to do in specific terms. If it's a one-page legislation, even an interim legislation, we pass interim legislations from time to time because we can't wait until we get a perfect legislation. But there's an immediate problem to be resolved. And we enact those kinds of legislation from time to time. Why is it that we can't enact some interim legislation to protect the depositors until the perfect legislation, the complex legislation is finalized? That is what is the public is impatient about, Dr. Lewis. We don't have anybody else to go to, you know. Only you we have. We can't go to the banks because we see what they do. So, no, we can do it for you. That's what we are here for. We are here to strengthen your hand, to let you serve the public more effectively. That's our job. When we fall short in doing that, lick us over the head and tell the public that we are derelict. Tell the public that the legislators are tardy in doing what needs to be done. To the credit of the JSF, they do that. They come to Parliament from time to time and tell us where the legislation we have is weak and what we need to do. I've had to deal with them in other committees of Parliament. They do that, and I welcome that. You are our eyes on the ground. You are our experts. We are not. So we really, really want you. Don't let perfection be the enemy of good governor. Don't sit and wait for a perfect legislation to be promulgated before something is done to ease the pain until the cure comes.
We're going to get a response from the BOG.
The only thing I can say is that I hear you, and the passion is clear. We don't have a connection to Parliament. We work through our minister. I know that he's very keenly aware of the issue. I don't know what else is in the pipeline going to Cabinet, but we have people working full-time on trying to get stuff to Cabinet. And I don't know that we can do any more than that.
Your pathway is not only to the minister. The Parliament has a standing finance committee meeting, right, where the agencies come, number one. There is the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, right? That gives you a direct pathway to the Parliament. Your pathway is not only to the minister. Your pathway, because you're an institution. The Bank of Jamaica is constituted through a legislation of this Parliament, not a legislation of the Ministry of Finance or the Minister of Finance. To the Parliament of Jamaica, where all 63 of us sit, including the Minister of Finance. There is an ongoing pathway. This committee is one such pathway. As many other entities will do, they will contact the committees to investigate in matters relating to them so that they can get support. And what we can do at the committee, we'll discuss it after, is to make a periodic engagement with the Bank of Jamaica to see if there's anything they need us to do. Just a periodic meeting to update, tell us where there's legislative deficiencies, where there are regulatory deficiencies, and where you need help. So we can help because we are responsible to the country at large. All of us. Committees of Parliament work on behalf of the full House. We don't work on behalf of our individual selves, but we work on behalf of the full House of the Parliament, which makes us accountable to the people on a whole, on both sides of the political fence.
All right, thank you, Chair. I had two follow-up questions. As it pertains to the 306 million, was those losses suffered by the banks, or were they allocated to the customers. Do we have any information as to who bear those losses in the final result? And I also heard you said DCP, that in some of the cases, the banks do not report what subsequent action was taken in terms of getting to some resolution, or if the matters are still outstanding. Is it something where they have internal processes that mandates them not to share that information? Or is it a case where there is no legislative framework for you to collaborate with the bank? That is my quick question. And then the other one, Dr. Lewis, DCP mentioned something quite salient earlier with respect to malwares or softwares that are installed independent. So this is not now an action of the customer. This is now an action of an independent actor. Has nothing to do with the bank per se. They didn't install it. So in cases such as those, where the customer is within no action of them that they would have suffered losses or some form of distress because they would have been prevented access to their own funds. In cases such as those, how would the bank, BOJ, the regulator, deal with those matters? Would it, again, put it to the police? How? I'm not clear as to that. And I think the public would like to know as well. Thanks.
Okay, in terms of the amount, we do not have the data whether or not the monies were refunded. That is the $306 million. It's just based on the report that we got from the victims of the fraud. There are instances where the victims do go directly to the banks, and during discussion, they will settle. So we don't have that data. And it's quite significant. I think the data that we provided is very subjective because I don't think it reflects the absolute.
It may not be accurate. Half of this could have been, half of this figure could have been reimbursed. Half of this figure could have been reimbursed.
In fact, the whole could have been, the entire amount. So, okay. Because what you find, some of the reports are directly from the victim, and some of the reports are actually from the bank. So the bank would make report, and the victim would make report. It depends on the type of entity. So we are not able to determine, in terms of who stand the loss.
So I can't hold this figure then as a wholesome figure. I just want the general public to know, and for myself as well, because this 306, it could be that the entire amount has been reimbursed or not. So we are not clear on that.
No, we are not clear. We are not clear on that.
All right.
And the other question you asked was...
prevention. Why isn't the bank working closer with... Because it would be in their interest as well to ensure that they report to you that these matters have been resolved, whether fulsome or in some way some settlement has been reached.
I'll just make one general statement on that. The financial institutions, their reputation is also important. And so if you have significant amount of fraud being perpetrated against a single financial institution, for argument's sake, reputational damage, they have to guard against that as well. So there are many variables, really, why we will not get some of those reports.
Yeah.
Yes, we treat it confidential, but for example, when arrests are made, etc., there was a time, I've been around long enough, that whenever fraud were committed against a bank, it was more prudent for them just to settle because they seek to protect the image. But over time, they realized that it was not helping. So once they started to make report to the police, then the type of infringement reduced. So, but we know the whole issue of reputation. And it's not just about banks, it's just about businesses. So those are some of the factors. Yeah.
A two-part question, so let me try and tackle the second question. In terms of, you were asking a question in terms of malware. So recall I had said there's a body of work. We have a guidance Then this is malware that has nothing to do with the customer. This is malware with the DTI. Recall that we had said that. Yes, right. So, but in this instance, I want to make a distinction between malware that's installed on the device of the customer versus malware that gets onto the operating system of the bank, because depending on that nuance, and I'm not an IT expert, I don't know if you have that competence, but there would be a different vulnerability and a pathway to be able to defraud or execute on the fraud. But what we have done is instituted guidelines that we will then examine banks against. So it's not just guidelines for guidelines' sake. We will then do the examination to see to what extent they are putting in place the measures that we have put in as minimum standards. I also mentioned that we'll be conducting penetration tests. And what penetration tests are is essentially evaluating the vulnerability of the IT systems of banks and giving them that report so that they can then remediate whatever. So a typical flaw in a bank's framework would be not updating your antivirus. If antiviruses that are installed on your operating system are not up to date, hackers can, even if it's a day old, they know the vulnerability, they can infiltrate, put a malware, and exploit the system of the DTI. And then I would have mentioned again the cyber sharing framework, which also is a part of that whole ecosystem that will ensure that there's integrity in the IT framework across the banking sector. Because if you know that they're targeting, for example, the web page to do with loan adjudication, and the fraud manifests itself and initiates there, then that's information that each bank can then look and do the interrogation to make sure that whether or not they have that particular vulnerability. And so what you'll be targeting is targeting not remediation bank by bank by bank. What you're doing is doing sort of a cross-sectional remediation where that particular vulnerability is eliminated across the financial sector. And I think that's a more effective way. And essentially what this boils down to is making Jamaica and our financial system an unattractive location for the execution of these cyber frauds. That's really what it is. It's the same way that if you're, live on a lane and there are a number of houses, the objective really is to make your house as unattractive to a criminal as possible. Because there's no way to say that you're going to have the most exquisite security system. You just need one that is more advanced than your neighbor, and then that becomes dissatisfying because they're not going to put in the effort to be able to, if they know they can hack a system in 30 minutes, they're not going to spend 5 hours when they know there's another jurisdiction where they can hack in 30 minutes. And as a jurisdiction, we have to make Jamaica unattractive to fraudsters. Make it painful for them to get the rewards, and then be dynamic enough to adjust, because they're not just going to go and walk away. If the front door is closed, they're going to go around the back. If the back is closed, they're going to go around the side, and they're going to evaluate. But once they realize that there's an alarm system in the digital world, there are redundancies, there are fail-safes, those are the things that make the jurisdiction unattractive. So that's what we're trying to build in terms of malware, because malware is essentially a key into the IT framework of the DTI, or via either the customer or the employee of or a third-party vendor to the bank. So those are the three sources. It's either a customer of the bank has a vulnerability, a third-party provider, or an employee of the bank. And the question is, how do you make sure that each of those stakeholders are sophisticated enough to be able to deflect the attacks or the setup for the attack, which is what the malware is intended to do. So those are the actions that we're taking. We're trying to be systematic about it. We're trying to build ground up, and we're trying to engage and collaborate to ensure that these are essentially we're unattractive to fraudsters. To point out, and I think DCP will be able to speak to this, I mean, not all of these fraudsters are Jamaicans, right? So we have persons who come into the Jamaican space from other jurisdictions. If they know you have a particular vulnerability, they're just going to exploit it and you know, take advantage of what they see. So it's an international issue that we're treating with. It's occurring locally, and we just have to collaborate across law enforcement, the banks, ourselves as supervisors, other regulators, the FSCs in the room, in that space, to make sure that we achieve our objectives.
So my observation is that and we want to know, this committee wants to know that this issue that we have focused on, about the digitalization and the connectivity and what that is doing to the system, that is being focused on, handled, and addressed. And there are two things that I've heard. First, there's a legislative redress, a work that is being done. And but I also, as I listen for solution, I'm hearing the commissioner, the deputy commissioner, making a plea because he described a time when there was greater collaboration with the banks, and then it's not anymore, at least to the same extent. I want to just clarify something. Governor, do you think that we can produce a Twin Peak legislation that does not fulsomely address, or there's a role in the process of development of this legislation that will include the police in the discussion, and are they a part of the development of this piece of legislation?
We are at the very formative stages of elaborating the market conduct side. And so it's a good and appropriate time to include them. And I must say, coming here today, I've been really impressed with the role that the police have played, which I was not fully aware of, just partially. And I'm happy to include them to bring us to a point where we can make that market conduct legislation even tighter than we had expected. So I welcome the opportunity and see that as a real benefit of coming here today.
If I could just add to that, even before the Twin Peaks, right now, as priority of us for the bank and the regulator is to build the resilience to these cyber risks and cyber threats. So that is why, as the Deputy Governor said earlier, we have issued a set of guidelines and standards that banks need to follow. Within the bank, we are also building our capacity to police the banks in relation to these standards. So we are building out our own supervisory capacity to do that. I mean, just a couple of months ago, we had experts that was facilitated by the IMF who came down to try and help us to build that out.
We would have trained about 60 to 70 examiners across both the Bank of Jamaica and the Financial Services Commission in terms of cyber supervision. So where we don't have the technical expertise, we do bring in experts to do that. They're all certified in this particular area, so that embedded in the guidance would be the architecture of supervisors who would be able to ensure that that guidance is being followed. And because cyber falls very neatly into safety and soundness, from an op risk perspective, the full force of the BSA can be brought into bear in terms of treating with that, and the full sanctioning and penalties of the BSA can be brought into force there. So there is just to elaborate on the point that Senior Deputy Governor is making.
So it's been actively pursued.
Yeah. So I'm interested in the timeline because the actively pursue. You see what the question and answer, the exchange here. He said to me that we have the commissioner's input and all of that. There's a vulnerability. I think that we see that, we hear that, we observe that. So the answer must be the question. And the question I asked was, well, I talked about Twin Peak and the complexities there, and I was asked about the design of that, because we want an effective piece of legislation when it comes. You have made a point, well, my colleague made a point about what we do in the interim, and you're making sharing the information that there are these things that are happening. But we don't know a timeline for the Twin Peak legislation yet. Presumably we're working diligently on it, and we're interested in that. What is the timeline you're working with to come up with? What are your objectives? What you're working towards in the consultation that you're having around this issue? What is your objective?
Are you speaking specifically to cyber risk or to the complete framework in relation to overall consumer protection matters? Okay.
Yeah.
So in relation to cyber risk, that is a now thing. That's something that we are doing immediately as we speak. We have to build the capacity internally. So as the Deputy Governor says, that's why we are on the training. Okay. All right, so that's a now thing. In terms of the broader, more comprehensive structure on the Twin Peaks, that will take some time. As it is now, we have worked on the concept paper. Okay, so that was done. We have had consultations with the financial sector on that. In collaboration with the Ministry of Finance, we are now working on the cabinet submission. But that in of itself is a process, as you know. And that's where we are. We are trying to complete that process, and hopefully we can complete the process for the cabinet submission certainly this quarter, which would then lay the basis for the drafting of the instructions for the legislation. But importantly, as the governor said earlier, we are not waiting on that. Wherever we can try to implement, certainly where consumer protection is concerned, we are trying to do that. And that is why we can talk about the standards, the ABM standards. Not only on the consumer protection side, but even on the prudential side, we're seeing where we can have much greater collaboration between ourselves, the prudential regulator from Bank of Jamaica side, and the FSC. So we're not simply waiting on the legislation, which is important, but we're looking to see where we can, within the confines of the law, try to address the pain points of the consumers.
The pain point. Let me just to complete, because I must tell you, I'm going to recount very quickly an experience I had with the president of, one of the former presidents of the JBA told me in response to a question I asked about dormant accounts and what's happening to those accounts. Yeah? Because, so you have the cyber, then you have the actual theft. I was told by the president that when I asked, well, why are those monies? He said that those were the most expensive money to keep in the banking system. I said, well, why is that? He said, because they're being stolen. I said, by whom? And they're dormant. He said, well, employees. He admitted that employees, these are favorite haunts of the employee to steal from. So I said, but that's your employee. And so what we had was, he was saying the risk for keeping them is higher because they're being stolen from their employees. And I'm saying, is that a situation that you're aware of?
As I have mentioned earlier, the banks are required to report any incident of fraud, including internal fraud, to us immediately, regardless of the dollar value. If it's $1, it has to be reported. If it's $2 million, it has to be reported. So the data that we have on internal fraud suggests that it fits the criteria of being low frequency, but tends to be higher value on average, right? Whereas, for example, debit and credit frauds, the typology is that it occurs frequently, but the values are smaller. So internal fraud is not a huge component of the reporting that we receive. Banks are required to identify the incident, report the incident, and report to us what caused the infraction, what weaknesses were exploited, and then the measures that they're going to take to close on that particular vulnerability. And some of the vulnerabilities are straightforward. If you have a staff member that never goes on vacation and is always doing one task, that's a vulnerability. It doesn't mean it's going to be exploited, but it means that there's no check and balance. And banking, the fundamental of banking is check and balance. So if you're entering cash into a vault, you should have two officers, one that's doing the transaction and one that is supervising the transaction, and both need to sign off. If you're taking cash from the ABM and loading it, and loading it into the vault, you need two officers and then a signing officer that the report goes to. And so some of these internal fraud events are as a result of perhaps policies not being followed, guidelines not being followed, and we are there to ensure that when those incidents do occur, that we follow up to make sure that those gaps are being closed. Low frequency, typically higher value on average from that fraud loss. The issue of dormant accounts is attractive to internal fraudsters because what typically happens is that those accounts are not surveilled as frequently as active accounts. And so unusual activities can prevail in those instances. What we have done is, I believe in 2022, we have done a thematic study on transaction monitoring, where we went in and tested each bank ourselves, digitally tested whether or not they had systems to determine whether or not unusual transactions were occurring, including one of those typologies, and it was over 200 different typologies that we tested across the banking system. One of those was whether or not they had systems that detected whenever a dormant account was being accessed. And where we saw vulnerabilities, they were written up and they were required to remediate. We went back the next year, we tested, and we saw the improvements. And so these are not things that we just simply sit back and say, we hope you do a good job. We surveil, we measure, we test independently, we verify that the issue is being dealt with, and then if necessary, we escalate to the board. And if the board is not responsive, they're not found to be fit and proper. So there is a mechanism in place from a supervisory perspective to assure the public, to assure members of parliament that in fact the banks are being held to a standard. And it's being done in a systematic way, not in a haphazard way. The results of those tests were reported in our financial stability report, 2021 and 2022. There's a report that talks about the central bank's foray in leveraging supervisory technology to assist in its supervision, because gone are the days where you send an examiner to go and count the money in a vault, or send an examiner to go and look at a loan trial balance. Those days are behind us. It's an ineffective, inefficient way to go about supervision. So we now use technology to assist us to be comprehensive in our review.
Implicit, I'm following up, right? Implicit in my question, though, is the two things. So I'm satisfied on that. I'm satisfied on that prong. What was implied in my question was that they said that was as a result of those fraudulent activities, they had to have a higher interest on those monies. This is before the fees. Yeah, this was before fees were introduced. that they started to take fees on these dormant accounts. So before fees, it was the charges, the interest rates that they were. Is that, so for their own internal frauds, these responses from the bank, is higher fees, before fees, higher interest, and now that fees are being charged, higher fees. Is that appropriate?
You mean charges?
On the dormant
charges
account.
on the dormant account,
dormant
not fees and interest, but charges on the dormant account.
Yes. For the protection, they told me, to protect them, I don't know. Or to compensate them from the losses.
To be clear, each year, actually semi-annually, banks report to us their fees. And those submissions, we review them. There's no bank that charges fees on dormant accounts, right? There's no bank. I think that was a practice that prevailed up to 2018.
Oh, you mean no longer?
No, yes. So I'm reporting the current. So up to 2018, it was a practice that prevailed. There is no bank that engages in charging fees on dormant accounts. And that's the report that we have up to December of 2023. So that's a practice that they have resolved from.
I'm glad my colleague raised that about the dormancy fee. You know, Dr. Lewis, why they stop and when they stop. Because I'd publicly threatened to sue them under the same duty of care provision. And within 2 weeks, all of them suspended the dormancy fee charge. But for me, the problem doesn't end there. Because billions of dollars were collected of those dormancy fee. And then my question to you, Governor, where someone puts the money in the bank and the bank deduct the charge and bring their account to zero and minus amounts, which have happened when they apply the dormancy fee. First question is the charging of the dormancy a breach of the act from the BOJ standpoint? Because I have not heard, Governor, the BOJ made a pronouncement on the legality of the dormancy fee as it exists in the law. And therefore, as a general principle, I am now submitting for the BOJ to advise or to indicate if the charging of dormancy fee constitutes a breach of Section 36. That's one. Two, if it is a breach of Section 36, though ceased in 2018, they would be illegally collected. That's a logical deduction. It's a breach of the law. And if it is a breach of the law, and it was illegally collected, what will be the recourse of the BOJ for those monies collected illegally? Because if I collect something from anybody illegally, the commissioner is going to lock me up. If I take something from somebody in breach of the law, he's going to prefer a charge. Whether larceny or whatever the description is, because I would have collected it illegally. So I am submitting to you now, Governor, for the BOJ, it was, I said, one, prefer a legal opinion internally, and I would submit that the most responsible thing to do, and I thought the BOJ would have done it, is to seek a judicial review, to let the court pronounce of it if you have internal doubts, uncertainty, given the impact of it, both in terms of the scope of the impact across the country and the quantum of the impact. Because if it is illegal, they would have robbed the customers. Literally robbed them. Because they would have broken the law to have collected that money. So the BOJ has a duty to ensure that fees that are collected are within the bounds of the law. So I'm going to ask you to do that. You have an internal legal department. to pronounce on it, and I'll submit that you need to even go further. Because one can easily deduct that the legal internal advice might be compromised for reasons which I won't elaborate on now, right? And so I believe the appropriate thing is to get from the Attorney General's chamber an opinion on the collecting of the dormancy fee against the provision of the existing law that prevailed at the time and up to, well, not up to, still continue under the Banking Services Act. So that is one. Now, I lost my train of thought on the second part, but I'll come back to it. But it related to, and I'm happy that my colleague here raised that. So those are two specific things. And I would like you to tell us, Governor, about how long from now we can get that response. Another week, another or so?
Well, certainly a response from our internal counsel, yeah. A week is not too long, no.
Okay. So you could just submit that to the clerk. But the other point I wanted to, Chairman, the point that Member Hilton raised about the bank saying that the risk of the internal theft, a former banker who is a senior officer in one of our national institutions, when we had the deliberations in here and the banks raised that point, called me, and just 2 days ago he called me back. Right? To say that in the bank that he used to work, NCB, the protocol that exists is that for dormant account, they are closed and no member of staff except senior officer can access a dormant account. It's locked. No teller, no junior officer can enter. They have a system internally that prohibits only prescribed persons can enter into dormant accounts. So this argument about being vulnerable to internal theft, he laughed at it because in his own experience at the time in NCB, it couldn't happen and it don't happen. And Dr. Lewis, what really is distressing and unfortunate is that the banks don't seem to have much regard for, you talk about professional reputation, institutional reputation. They have destroyed their reputation by their practices. They have destroyed their reputation by what they failed to do, which is unfortunate because it will help us as a country. Because we need to have a sound banking system, not only sound from your prudential oversight, but we want to have a banking system that the world can feel comfortable to come in. We want investors to come here. We want people who owe money to come and believe that the banks in Jamaica are reputable, honest people, respecting people, trustworthy people. But you go to survey the public out there. They equate them to scammers. It's not because of their own, the public's doing, their own doing and failure to do. So this crap argument about internal theft, why the dormant account is being lost, is an insult to any first grader's intelligence. And you must not allow them to proffer those kind of arguments and get away with it. Yes, Dr. Lewis, you must not. You are the supervisor.
I have a question with regards to the ABM. Clarification first. We got a report that said ABM information request for the month of April 2023. Is it 2023? And not 2024, right? It's 2023.
We're in the process of collating the data for March 2024 as well as the data for April. So
okay, so you would have you would have February.
yes, so January and February of 2024 should be there.
We have reports, but they are not saying average time down. I'm not seeing those. Is there? Oh, I never got those. So, but can I get a copy, please, for February? But the question I have is the month that I have is showing downtime in rural area, the downtime for machine. 3 days is much more than in the urban space. And I don't want to be parochial, but I'm a member of parliament for a rural constituency. And these are complaints that, you know, persons have to travel miles when the machines are down, and especially on weekends. On weekends. So I heard, Governor, you had mentioned, I was listening to a radio station where you had opined that sanctions, the legislation as it is, does not allow for sanction. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But what do we do if we are just giving out standards and code, and if there is breach? I think the public would want to know, really, what powers do we have? And I've been doing a little research myself with regards to the various legislation, and I don't know if it would, Section 34 of the BOJ Act, because as you said earlier, is prudential, right? And does it extend to enforcement of the standard that you have put out? Because if we don't have any sanction left to the banks alone, we might not see anything from it.
Yes, so the absence of sanctions is a definite disability. But nonetheless, we have to work with it because the public and Parliament, and when I go to Cabinet, I get the same complaints. I think they are real and need to be addressed. And so what we have done is called in the banks and in a spirit of cooperation, got them to agree that they must, with urgency, do something about the service. Now, I can't say that, you know, that it will be great in the future, it will be consistent, but I believe that it should be given a chance to operate and to prove itself. And in the absence of the sanctions, we don't have an alternative. I feel personally that the banks know that their reputation is open to damage if they cannot improve on the service from the ABMs. Further damage, yes. I think they are sensitive to it and that they will comply and seek to do their best. So I just ask for a little patience while we try to make this interim system work. Call us back in another couple of months and let us see what the data shows in terms of uptime of machines and so forth. In respect to the question about the rural ATMs, it really boils down to a matter that the cash is pretty much centralized in Kingston, and it has to be moved to various rural locations to replenish machines. If a machine breaks down, the repair persons have to go some distance. It's really that drives the lag between getting our urban ABM machine back up and running and getting a rural ABM machine back up and running. Sometimes, too, you have problems with the telecoms. You know, they may be a little more robust in Kingston than they are in some of the rural areas. Power sometimes goes down a little more frequently in rural areas. So those are the things that interfere with the service levels between rural and urban.
I hear you, Governor, but looking at your own report, and I know the Deputy Governor want to say something, but let me just, based on your own report, why is it that some banks are able to keep it less than 1 day, right? While other banks who have fewer machines is 8 days downtime? You know, it's really something to be looked at, because if we weren't getting some banks doing well in the rural space, and I'm talking about rural areas, specifically for rural areas, that persons have to leave from one machine. And if you can take into consideration some of the branches in the rural space, they were the first to be closed down and replaced by ABMs. And the folks have to drive miles to go to a different ABM machine. And that sometimes is matter of life and death. Because sometimes they are trying to get funds to take their loved ones to the hospital and to the doctors. And so I'm really looking at this and saying that if I had seen where all the banks were having this challenge, where it's 8 days or 3 days, even 2 days is very long. You know, it's a concern of the public. It's a concern in the rural space, a concern that we as Member of Parliament has to deal with. You can go ahead, please. Can you turn up?
So I hear the pain in in what you said. We need to remember this is a snapshot right at the beginning of the process that we are trying. Right? So I'm hoping that in a couple of months' time it will improve as we go along, and even the laggards amongst the banks will improve. To make the point, however, modern ABM machine is a very expensive piece of equipment, and banks are putting that equipment there to provide service, yes, and they expect that service to pay back for the machine. And oftentimes in some rural areas, that's not the case. There is no economic payback for the machines. And that's understandable. So what the government has said is that they are willing to partner with, and the banks have said, we welcome that concept of partnering in order to provide rural communities with more machines so that the quality of service can be better. And that is something that is actively being considered. For example, to find locations that are secure, sometimes the government has those locations. Could be in a police station, could be in a postal service location. So that's a kind of cooperation that can operate. Also, if the government is so inclined, they may want to subsidize the presence of a machine in an area that can't pay for itself, but it's a public good and a public service. And the banks have said, we are happy to work with you on that kind of relationship. So we're right at the beginning of the process. And I would just want to crave your indulgence and patience to see whether this rapport and that relationship we have with the banks can bring better service to all, whether rural or urban.
Just to add what the governor is saying, armed with this data, what we'll now do is actually investigate, follow up with the banks as to what is particularly happening in that particular jurisdiction. So you mentioned the 8 days, for example, with that one institution. When we look back at the data, because we also look at the trends, that seemed to be a problem with the month of February, because when you look at the data for January, that specific institution, their downtime was very, very low. So we have to analyze the data carefully and then investigate exactly what is it that could have particularly happened during the month of February with that particular institution, and then we'll have discussions as to what are the remedial steps. So that's the importance of first gathering this data, so that it will enable us to act in a very informed manner.
Just to follow on from both the governor and the senior deputy governor, that we're publishing the information. We'd have published the results for the month of January. At the beginning of April, we published the information to the public for February. And essentially, the dynamic that we're using is disclosure, right? So hitherto, banks would know their own performance, and that performance would be reported internally to senior management, would go to the board and so on. But they would know their own performance and not necessarily understand how other persons in the industry are performing. This is disclosure, and in consumer protection frameworks, not just the ones that we're building here, but globally, disclosure is an important tool in that particular framework, because recall, what you're trying to do is you're trying to incentivize for excellence. Incentivizing for excellence is not the same as trying to penalize for a minimum standard. So for example, if you want to make sure that a bank always closes its front door to protect the vault, you can put a sanction to say, if we observe that you have left your vault door open, we're going to sanction you X amount. You may get compliance with that. But think of an equivalent where you're trying to sanction a hotel for providing excellent world-class service to tourists. It's difficult. Why? Because the incentive for the change in behavior isn't around a minimum standard for the food. It is around creating an experience which is memorable. And so consumer protection frameworks don't only use sanctions, they also leverage disclosure. Of course, that's predicated on the fact that banks want to preserve their reputations. The dynamic that we will observe over time, this is just 2 reports, is whether banks will begin to compete amongst each other to see whether they can outdo each other in terms of ABM performance. Will we observe that over time? Will we get a dynamic similar to the Olympics? You know, when athletes go and they train privately, you may get a different performance for when they are performing in front of an entire stadium. And so we're looking to see whether or not there will be change in behavior, not just because there is the ABM standard, and the supervisor will be looking through those reports. But whether or not this will not be part of bragging rights amongst the industry to say we can outdo our fellow licensee in that area. That's something we'll be looking very closely. I think it's, as the governor would have said, it's very early days yet. The report has the number of ABMs that they have per region. The report has the amount that is working, because there's no point saying that you have 10 ABMs and none of them are working. So we're measuring that and publishing that. We're measuring how many of them were operating with an uptime, and we're measuring them against 95%. So those that are working, how many are working above 95% of the times? We're measuring them against 24 hours a day. So we're saying, are you able to provide that ABM service, not just 8 a.m. in the morning to 8 p.m. at night? Are you able to do that over a 24-hour period? That's what we're measuring them against. And when those machines do go down, we're measuring them against how long it takes you to bring the machine up. I think over time, with that sort of visibility, bright lights, we may get change in behavior that I think we all are looking forward to.
Member Lawrence.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've been listening generally to all the discussion, questions and answers, and so far, I think we are getting somewhere in terms of the whole banking system, whether through the fraud, whether online banking or otherwise. But there's a small section that has been mentioned where people have problem generally. So I'll ask the first question, if there is a lifetime for the ABM machines. Reason being, there's a lot of people who gone to the ABM machines, try to withdraw their money. But then we have this problem between the transaction, the person do the transaction, the machine actually register the money for payment. You don't receive the money. But then you don't know where to go from there. You carry your problem to the bank, and the bank will look at you and say, well then, we then check the system, you're supposed to receive the money. You don't receive it, so this poor customer, banker, live in a situation where the bank system is showing that they actually receive the money, but yet the money doesn't come from the machine. So I believe personally that not only checks in terms of the machines and the downtime or the uptime, but I believe you need regular checks to ensure that people get what they punch in really comes out to them, instead of you punch and it's like you get in here because the money doesn't reach to you, but the system is showing that you receive it. You go into the bank, the account is showing that you receive the money and there is no money out. So we're just looking at it and say, well then, we think it would be wise for the BOJ as a regulator to ensure that, one, there should be a lifespan for the machine, although BOJ governor mentioned earlier that they are very expensive. But then you still have a lot of, especially poor people who doesn't know online banking, who really suffers greatly from that.
Just to say that the standards do cover issues around cash availability. They do address issues around customer redress, in particular in the area of the performance of the ABM. And recall that this is all within the context of the Code of Conduct, which has obligations for the DTI. What does all of that mean in English? If a customer goes to our ABM and it doesn't dispense what they had requested, the bank has an obligation under the Code of Conduct to do an investigation. That investigation can be conducted by the internal audit of the bank that can verify whether or not there was an issue with the machine or whether or not there was some sort of incorrect action on the part of the customer that was engaging with the ABM. Under the standard, they do have requirements to have video cameras in the ABM that can be used in that investigation. That footage should be able to be verifiable. And the only thing that's not to be caught by the video footage is the actual PIN entry. But everything else about the transaction should be caught on the video. And things like seeing whether or not the customer was actually counting cash is a good, in that particular instance, is a good check. Because if the customer is saying, I did not receive any money, then the question would be, why were you counting cash? No, the complaint could be that it didn't give me the right amount, and that's a legitimate concern. And so it would be then incumbent on the bank to check. The bank knows how much cash was put in the system in the morning, and the bank, just like a teller, knows you can compute how much funds are in the machine at the end of the day. And therefore, if you look at all the debits and all the credits, and the bank has, the ABM has more cash in it relative to all its deposits and its payouts, then you can determine that the customer, in fact, did not receive the cash. So the code of conduct is the first port of call. The customer is to write to the DTI to say that I had this incident, this is what happened. The bank has an obligation to, the commercial bank has an obligation to investigate that complaint and to make the necessary redress. If the customer is still dissatisfied, the customer has the right to write to the Bank of Jamaica, and we have an email address, customer.complaints@boj.org.jm, and we evaluate all of those complaints. We log it into a database. There's a team, and the only thing that team does is read the complaints that come to us, and then we write to the DTI. The DTI, having investigated it once more, coming to a conclusion that's not favorable to the customer still has the right to go to the police. In the standard that we issued, we required that the DTI holds the video footage for 180 days. How did we come up to that number? We consulted with the banks, we consulted with MOCA, we consulted with the JCF to determine what's a reasonable time within which an investigation can be done and which video evidence, if necessary, can be carried to court. So it can be entered into evidence whether against the favor of the bank or whether against the favor of the customer. So we gave enough time so that the investigation having been caused to be started, that can be entered into as part of the matter to come to a determination. So there are several ports of call in relation to that particular specific matter where the customer has mechanisms for redress. And I have certainly presided over complaints where the customer is compensated. So it doesn't mean it's happening every time, but I certainly have viewed instances where the bank, having done the investigation, realizes that it is at fault and the customer is compensated. So that's broadly the framework that exists currently and is supported by the guideline that was issued on April 3rd.
Okay, we have about 2 more questions. Member Jackson and then Molan.
I have three specific questions, team. But you know, Dr. Lewis, when I listen to your preamble about the standards and the compliance and voluntary compliance and the reputation that the banks want to preserve while through moral suasion they will adhere. You know, you saw me smiling, I said, boy, I'm not saying that you're being utopian, because given the experience of the banks and their practices, it wants to border and being utopian, which brings into question the whole issue of the absence of sanction. Commissioner will tell you, somebody that have a reputation of certain practice, they don't hold out so much hope that they're going to voluntarily comply, They rely on enforcement because their reputation speaks very loud. That said, I know that in the standards promulgated, you have a 9-month period for compliance for all the stipulations in it. And I take it that different provisions, and by the way, I believe that the provisions, the areas covered, is pretty comprehensive. Generally, I must proffer that to you. I was heartened when I read the depth of the provision. And so my comments now is not a wholesale condemnation, but some areas which I think is critical to give real meaning to what is here. So you have a 9-month compliance period for all of these provisions. Some is smaller, some is more major. So, Governor, I would believe that you would categorize the different provisions. This one or these within the next month. These within the next 2 months. For some that you need infrastructure upgrading or changing, which will take some time for procurement and all of those things, they would go at the longest period. But you lump all of them together. And so long as they are up to this 8.5 months, if they do nothing, they would not in breach of these standards. Almost 1 year to do nothing. And you could just easily put them in groupings and give specific timelines for those. You leave them for almost 1 year that they could possibly do nothing and only seek to comply at the 11th hour. So I am submitting that you recalibrate the timeline for these so that we can have immediate, where possible, compliance in some of those quote-unquote low-hanging fruits. The second one, you said that there are no legal authority to impose pecuniary penalties. Now, my question in that regard, team, are there any laws prohibiting setting those financial penalties? And if so, what are those provisions in law that prohibits you? That's on the first point. And the second point, if there is no legal prohibition, well, if there's none, why not? But in where you need legal strengthening or legal groundings to impose that, have you made such requests to the Minister of Finance to bring them to Parliament to give you those teeth, so to speak? Where you need law to impose financial penalty, where there is the requirement for legal strengthening, have you made any such submissions? And if you have not, when will you advance those? Because in the same way that we pass constitutional amendment here in 1 day, I assure you that my colleagues on both sides of the House will come even at midnight and pass a law to strengthen your ability to impose financial penalty for breach of them, because they want the protection. The people want the protection. So that is the second of the three that I want to. Well, it is two in the last one I give, where there is absence of legal, if there is any legal prohibition, yes or no? And two, if there is the need for any, have you advanced any to the BOJ, to the Ministry of Finance, sorry.
Thank you for those questions. Let's start with the issue of whether or not there's anything that prohibits the central bank from issuing sanctions. I'm not the legal expert, but I don't believe there's anything that prohibits us. I think the issue is that if the bank issues sanctions, those sanctions cannot be ultra-virus its principal act, because, of course, the sanctionee, the person being sanctioned, always as a citizen or a legal person has the right to redress in court. So if the matter is contested, we would want to make sure that we are on strong footing, because of course we also have our reputations as supervisors, as regulators. So we wouldn't want to be entering into a matter where we suspect that if it is challenged in the court of law, that we would be found wanting because we acted ultra-virus our law. So I think that's the reason why you'd want a law that explicitly allows you to issue sanctions, is to eliminate legal uncertainty should you be challenged. We have used moral suasion to get the guidelines that we have, and we're using the mechanism of public disclosure as an incentivizing impetus to encourage banks to conform to what we want. And the anticipation is that once the legal framework for Twin Peaks, with an authority with the mandate so to do, has that, then these guidelines would then be converted into regulations. So the work we're doing now, and we've started with the ABMs, as the governor would have mentioned, we're going to be moving to other matters, is to then have everything in black and white, such that it can then very quickly be able to be converted into regulations, and the necessary sanctioning frameworks under that regulation would then take effect. So we're building the road, driving on it, and trying to make sure that we reach a destination that I think we're all anxious to reach in the shortest possible time, but in a time that ensures that the framework hangs together in a very internally consistent way. Nobody's going to benefit if there are obvious weaknesses in the framework that are subject to legal challenge. Nobody wins. I don't think anybody in that environment wins, and that's the essential reason for the approach that we have taken. I know it doesn't address all of your concerns.
Look, no, just for clarification. When I ask if there is any legal prohibition, implicitly is that legal prohibition that would not make you legally vulnerable. You were pointing out about it being ultra-virus, etc. I was asking straight if you could not do it within the legal framework that is existing. And I would not suggest that you do anything that will make you legally vulnerable or to cause any of them to come back at you, so to speak.
Sure.
Put it in simple terms. And then the corollary to that was that in the absence of that, have you made submissions for that on a fast-track basis? Or is it being left to the Twin Peak regime that was mentioned, was made of earlier on? So that is specifically what I want to get to. Is there an absence of legislative provision that will allow you to impose financial penalty in the first instance? Mm-hmm. And if that is the case, that there is an absence of legislation, are you seeking to fast-track the promulgation of such?
Yeah, so the answer to the first question directly is that there is no legal overarching framework to allow us to issue sanctions in relation to consumer protection matters. For us to issue sanctions under the Banking Services Act, we have to be able to demonstrate that it is a matter that would impact on the safety and soundness of a financial institution. So, for example, in the case of ABMs, we'd have to demonstrate that at service levels of 70% of all your ABMs, as a licensee, you are no longer compliant with your obligation to issue currency, for example. And so that's the measure, but that's not a measure of excellence, which is what consumer protection is about. Consumer protection is about performance at 99% and 100%. It's not about thought processes where there's still some amount of service deliverable, but it's not a good customer experience. So the frameworks, there's incongruence between the two frameworks, between what we would like to have and what our legal framework really allows. I don't know if that is as clear as possible. In relation to the second matter, in order to treat with that, because it's not just a causal absence, it's a fundamental absence. Because of that, there needs to be a legislative framework in primary law, right, that would be needed to be established, and that we're proposing would land with Twin Peaks. And you can't do subsidiary legislation before primary legislation. You have to do primary legislation and then support it by subsidiary. So the law, your act, will always supersede your regulations, which always supersede your standards, which will always supersede your guidance, and so on and so forth. And that's it. And then you have moral suasion, which is the weakest part of your artillery, so to speak. So that's essentially the state of play. I don't know if that
There was a third one about the 9 month.
Yes, go ahead.
Right, thanks. Member, perhaps in retrospect, I mean, we could have tried to calibrate specific timelines for each. But just to emphasize the intention, and certainly in our discussions with the banks and the commitments of the bank, the idea is not to wait until 9 months to have everything in place. The intention is to ensure that we actually begin to see some progress on each of these as soon as possible. So perhaps we could have imposed.
No, will you, if it can? You said it was as what the intention was.
Yeah,
if it can be, why not?
We'll consider it, and we'll go back to the banks and consult with them on it. But the bottom line is that...
But Doc, in the process of the consultation to have brought these about, wouldn't that bit of information would have been procured in terms of each of them and how long they would take to institute them?
Right. No,
No, they have to, no, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. So let me just clarify the process. So typically with standards or guidelines, we will sit with a committee. In this particular instance, it was a subcommittee of the Bank of Jamaica, the supervisory arm, and the subcommittee members from the Financial Services Commission, who we are anticipating would eventually take on the full remit of consumer protection and market conduct. We, as part of all our processes, we would then share that draft with the JBA and all its members. We would get comments. We would review those comments. We sat with experts from other jurisdictions who understand and have implemented consumer protection frameworks, got their advice, went back to the banks, and determined. Our focus, admittedly, was on the content of the guideline, to make sure that it was comprehensive, to make sure that it treated with the mischief that we've been experiencing as a country in relation to cash availability and so on. So it's a very wide-ranging standard. Admittedly, when we went through it, it was determined that because it's so far-reaching, and it's affecting a wide cross-section of the activities of the bank, that we'd want to give them enough time so that they don't feel that we're doing a gotcha framework where you say, here's the rule, and then tomorrow morning you come and you say, you know, you're in compliance. You're not in compliance, and therefore, and this is a standard part of what we do. There's always a transitional period, whether it is something to do with capital or it's a cyber guideline, whatever, there is a transitional period. I think we could have done timelines per aspect of it. That's something that we could have done. It's something that we can go back to them and have the discussions. I think where we are now, however, is that each DTI needs to submit to us their action plan to tell us how they plan to meet the obligations that come under these guidelines. And we look at each of those plans individually, because what may be very straightforward to do from one bank who just has 10 ABMs may not be straightforward for a bank that has 250. And so we have to bear in mind that when it comes to compliance, it's not a one-size-fits-all. For some, one provision in terms of making sure that their facilities are friendly to persons who are physically disabled, that provision can be made within 2 months. For another, it may take a much longer period of time. So that was the thought process. Let me just finish with one last thing. So each under the Banking Services Act, we do not prescribe the business model of the bank. What we say is that regardless of your business model, you need to meet these criteria: governance, how you manage, how you report to us, and those things. In terms of stipulating that you must approach your business model in a particular way, that we're not prescriptive. And so in that, since that's a broader context within initial licensees, and when you look at the report, you'd notice that banks differ in terms of how they distribute their ABMs across the island, right? We don't prescribe to say every DTI must provide ABMs in each parish. We don't do that. So I think whereas we could have prescribed timelines for each, I think we'd run into a bit of problem because the nuances of each DTI is different. And then you could then run into a situation where as a supervisor, you're basically holding one licensee to a particular standard that they can easily reach and holding another to a standard that you know they can't reach. And those are some of the nuances that we would have run into.
But quickly though, Doctor, I'm not suggesting for you to prescribe any business model. What I'm expecting to prescribe is a minimum service provision. Minimum service, not a business model. That's one. Number two, take your point about the varying capacity of each to adhere. And it's against the background of a transition into a standards arrangement where the absence of any. I wouldn't see it, I don't think the public would see it unreasonable if, by virtue of size, range, a bank with 200 machines against one with 10, you said, okay, in respect of this provision, you will have X amount of time for compliance, which will vary from the other one, recognizing the varying situation with each. But at least the public knows what performance level to hold that particular institution to. Right now, everybody is cast in the 9 months, regardless of your size and capacity. So the ones who can do it quick don't have the real incentive to do it quick because they have 9 months. So against that background, I do believe that you need to revisit it within that context. We want to hold them accountable to the very same things that they voluntarily agreed to do. Because left on their own, they will not do it. And that's a track record. Don't agree?
Thank you, Member Jackson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I think they touched on it, and it was the last comment that was made, because I'm speaking specifically in the case of Westmoreland, because I've had several, even news reporters who have come to me speaking about the ATMs, because at one point we had, I think, about 6 ATMs in one location, but because of robberies and other incidences, which is very unfortunate, by the way, I need to place that on record, we have the banks reevaluating where these locations are. And that's why I was very hopeful, Governor, when I hear you mention of a private-public partnership. And it kind of shows that despite not coming out publicly, that work is being done to address some of these concerns. And I would encourage the bank as well to make mention, even though it may be premature, we don't want us to preempt what is happening, but just to let us know that you're working on these things, because it gives an impression that the bank is not taking action. So I was very encouraged when you mentioned that action is being taken in terms of doing some public-private partnership to locate these ATMs. And in a context of Westmoreland, we have probably just under 300,000 people. Based on the report that I just got, I count 15 ATMs. And that is definitely not adequate, I can tell you, for the parish. And in some instances, persons have to wait, you know, an extended amount of time to get service. And just imagine traveling 15 miles to an ATM, and when you reach it, run out of money. It's not pretty. And in other instances where you have persons, majority of workers now are being paid through the banking system. Once there's a Friday evening, you know, or month end, the ATMs are, this is just reality of Jamaica. The ATMs have very, very long lines. And you have persons opting to probably go to the ATM at 12 o'clock in the night, like myself, because that's when you can actually access it. And of course, you know the security risk around that. But it is something that I am very encouraged that the bank is looking at. I think you delved a bit as to my question and how we can expand on it, because for the larger banks, despite them having more ATMs in the context of Westmoreland, sometimes the ATMs are just out of service for whatever reason. They run out of cash, there's a power glitch, and that is a very good contribution from member Lawrence, who mentioned that I have gone to the ATM just last week to withdraw funds, and it showed that the funds was dispersed, but it came back. You know, whatever internal mechanisms the bank had, it came back in the account. But in the initial stage, it did indicate that it was withdrawn. So that is a good thing on the side of the bank. But if you were in desperate need of the cash in such a situation, it would be a quite disheartening thing as well. So I just want to encourage the bank to continue. You answered my question, but I wanted to place on record that this is a serious concern, and I've even done interviews about it, because workers in Little London area and in New Hope, where there were ATMs, there's none now. In Grange Hill, where there's an ATM, 3 days out of service is a regular thing. And persons have to travel 9-10 miles to actually get to a point where they can access cash. And the banks are closing, they're reducing their footprint. So I think in that code of conduct, you have to put some emphasis on them having some point of contact for their customers. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Wilson. With that said, I want to thank the Bank of Jamaica, headed by Governor Biles, and our JCF, headed by Deputy Commissioner Bailey. We certainly got a fulsome report from both institutions. One of the main things coming out of this meeting is that educating the public with regards to some aspect of prevention of losses is key. I don't know which agency or agencies should be doing that, but certainly we need to get it out in a simple way so that all persons, whether they are computer literate or not, will understand certain things. And I'm hoping that that can be out there on social media, just about everywhere, where persons, the normal man, can understand what are the don'ts and what, if you do so, what may happen, and the impact, just the impact that may derive from it. And also that within that space that the bank is liable in certain circumstances that you would have breached your contract and so on. So I'm open. I'm really, the other thing that comes out of this discussion is there's a need for continuation and improvement with the collaboration between the JCF and the bank, so that there is no longer this silo where persons are sent to the police to make a report and there is no connection as to what is happening in between that person leaving the space of the bank and going to the police force, which they, the police station, which they may never go at all. And that absent of that being reported and investigated may cause other incidents, similar incidents, to be happening, because the public would not know that this is happening in the public sphere. And so we are hoping, as the governor rightfully pointed, that he will be, when he meets with the Bankers Association, and he will be bringing up the point, the recommendation that DCP Bailey had put on the floor. We certainly want to thank you both, institution, and for coming.
There are a couple of things that undertaking or intimation that the governor made, which we could try to finalize before we go. I think he indicated, Governor, another 2 months, that there should be some significant changes as a result of the standards that have been promulgated, notwithstanding my comments about the 9-year, almost 1 year, 9-month open-ended period. Is it that we will get a report updating us on what the performance has been in that regard? That's one. Number two, the cybercrime incidences that the commissioner alluded to, for which you indicated the collaboration in terms of what will happen next in terms of operationalizing that. Is it that there are going to be some periodic or structured interaction between your people and his people in order to get that going? And I'm saying that's against the background, Chairman. We want to, whatever we have been able to achieve from this dialogue this morning, we want to be able to ensure that it be operationalized for not for the beauty of it, but to reap the results that cause us to be here in the first instance. So I would like to get a sense of where that is going to go from here. You know, what the commissioner said, the banks send the people to them, and they are kind of nowhere. Yes. We want that collaboration, because there are practices, Governor, that Commissioner pointed to. For example, with NCB, the high level of collaboration, to the extent that the collaboration brings result that mitigates the problem, it should not be left in to just occur just in one institution.
The governor had said, to be fair to the governor, he had said earlier that at the next meeting of the Bankers Association, he will be bringing up on their agenda to see how best they can improve that. And I'm thinking that the governor will...
Yes, I'm mindful of that. I'm mindful of that. But he said something more. What he said is very true about advising the Bankers Association of what you have here heard. But in terms of the collaboration between the JSAFE and the BOJ, that's the point that I'm, in terms of that structural interaction, that is the point I'm more concerned about. Because you see, Chairman, we speak for some years now across administration about the whole principle of joined up government. These are two arms of the state, right? And we must, that principle of joined up government must be functional. We must bring the benefit of it to bear on how each entity operates for the benefit of the society. So I just like if we could just get a sense of that. And as I said earlier on, when we get, and Dr. Lewis will tell us upon doing the relook at the 9-month spread, if you can break it down into different categories, even categories of standards for adherence, and even if you want to give varying timeline for different institutions for the same particular standard, we meaning we the public, would see it as part of the transitional arrangement until, say, after 9 months, everybody would be on the same level or compliance level. So you can't say because you have more challenge, use 9 months and you can do it in 3 months and you don't. You get what I'm trying to speak to?
Yes. Yeah. Go.
So, yes. So, Chairman, we are happy to attend any meeting in the future that you may want to call us to. The beauty of what we are doing though on the ABMs is that it's public and it's fully transparent, which means that every month, is it every month? Every month we're going to be publishing. So you yourself can track. You don't even need us to come unless you want to beat us up. And I hope there won't be a need for that. So you'll be able to see it yourself every month as we publish it. But I must say, Chairman, that coming here today has been useful. If I came at the beginning committed to seeing this process through, I think that this meeting has redoubled the need for me to be totally committed to it. Let's be clear though, you are really asking this one institution, Bank of Jamaica, to not only oversee the prudent operation of the banking system, but you're also saying you must at the same time build from scratch this market conduct framework and customer protection. And as you build it, operate it. We take the challenge on, but it is an onerous one, and we ask that you just give it a little time. I feel, that the banks are seized of the need to improve customer service, and in particular to address some of the issues that members here have raised and others have raised that the public is very hurt about. And I feel that the banks will address it. So I'm asking you for a little patience to see that process work itself through. Give us a couple of months and watch the data. Invite us back. We're happy to be here to discuss what is going on.
We'll invite you back, Governor, 9 months after, to give us the result, at least 9 months after. But thank you, honorable gentlemen and lady. Members, we now go back to confirmation of the minutes. The minutes having been circulated, they are taken as read. Is there any amendments to the minutes, to these minutes?
Here, ascribed
Can
to me.
you just tell us the page, Member Hilton?
Page 5 of 6.
Page 5 of 6.
Yes.
And
it
paragraph.
says, first paragraph, Member Hilton posited that the purpose of a parliamentary committee was to unearth an amplitude of information. Now, I don't speak in those terms. Amplitude? Amplitude of information. That's correct. Was to unearth sufficient information. Sufficient information against reasonable judgments and recommendations. Huh? No. Well, I mean, I'd love to see that. I read it back though.
That's correct.
That's correct.
There's not a contentious issue.
Yeah.
But
judgments.
Any other amendments?
Against which?
Any other amendment, members? There being no other amendments, can we get a move by Member Jackson, seconded by Member Lawrence? So we now move to AOB.
no, before we go to AOP, Chairman,
Wait.
sorry, an indictment not to. The discussions between the BOJ and the JCF confirm the wisdom in having both together rather than separately. And the truth of the matter, Chairman, this is not out of any genius on my part. It's just out of experience. And you have seen before your own eye where just being here together talking about the subject has helped both institutions. If they had come separately, that would not happen. And we have proven this year after year in these kinds of committees. When you have the various entities, both private and all the entities relating to the subject, it allows for the subject to be better interrogated, more thoroughly, and strengthen each institution. I was delighted to see both the BOJ was welcoming of knowing of the experience firsthand and to be able to have them elaborate on it, and vice versa. We must not allow these experiences that we have garnered over the years to be snuffed out and away for some other reasons. So and I hope that going forward, we be so guided by these.
The point noted, member. Any other business? There be no other business. A date for the next meeting will be announced, and we therefore go for the adjournment. There was nothing for the 8th. And we had scheduled the 8th just in case the discussion or the discourse would go beyond. All right? So, but we will need to meet to have further discussion because there are other And I have noted the minutes of the previous meeting. And having noted the meeting of the previous meeting, we will need to invite, and I'm thinking PIOJ as well, to come here and to give us a report on some items that was mentioned in the minutes of that meeting. Okay? Let me hear from Member Hilton. Member Hilton.
Chairman, if I recall, the minutes of that meeting, of the previous, the first meeting, sought to address the post-COVID environment and what were some of the lessons learned, if you will, and some responses. And yes, PIOJ, so is the suggestion that you're making that as of today, because you're correct in that.
What I'm suggesting, member, is that that we do not deviate from that minutes, and we invite the PIOJ to give us a report in accordance to those discussions, and we within reasonable time by next week, member, we would circulate some dates for us to meet.
Yeah.
Very well?
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't necessarily have to do it now, but if we're going to invite PIOJ, I would like us to be as definitive in any particular area. So, for example, in the area of domestic agriculture, right? That is one. Even domestic agriculture, we could look at particular area, the poultry industry, the pig rearing industry, right? How are we performing there? And we could use the PIOJ as an outlet into that. So we do the work in terms of digging deep in the areas. PIOJ don't produce anything except report.
Yes, and so we could provide the framework and ask.
Yes.
Right?
So I mean, we need to do that so we can plan at least for the next 3 or 4 sets of meeting. There's lots of work to do.
So we will, as I said, we will get to it. All right, member. With that said, we now stand adjourned.
Jamaica's economy is in the best shape